Good morning. Good morning. Leo, can you hear me?
Yes, John, I can hear you.
Okay.
I think everyone can.
Okay, that's fine. Thanks. Good morning. My name is John Mutua. I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs as a programs coordinator. And I'm pleased to invite you to today's webinar. So this is the 5th webinar this year that the Institute of Economic Affairs is holding or hosting. So just as a way of providing some small background, the Institute of Economic Affairs is a think tank that promotes debate and dialogue on public policy issues. And we work in 6 thematic areas. And of the 6, the program that is sharing some insights of today's webinar is a Constitution, Law and Economics program. We will introduce, the 2 presenters will say something small about, the first presenter will say something small about the program. But basically, IEA, in addition to just basically providing or promoting debate and dialogue on public policy issues, what we do is to try and provide insights on important topical policy issues, as well as insights around unobserved events. Now, the Institute of Economic Affairs has been tracking or monitoring the Index of Economic Freedom since 2019. So this is the 4th successive debate or webinar that we will have around this index. So this is an annual index, and more of the background, the methodology, all that will be shared by or presented by our 2 speakers today. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritties of this or the nuts and bolts of this index, I just want to mention that often what we see in the social media, especially in the social media or in the media, about people trying to compare countries in terms of their economic development, economic growth, and so on. The things that growth is associated with are often to do with what we see, the optics, basically roads, skyscrapers, and so on. Whereas those give some story about growth or economic development, they do not tell, they do not provide a holistic or the whole story. So this index tries to provide that holistic story of where we are as a country in comparison with other countries globally, regionally, and globally. Not only in terms of just physical infrastructure, but in other ways. And those insights will actually be shared. And of course, this is not the only index that tries to provide a holistic story. There are other indices. And again, through these insights, we believe that we'll provide the public with things that they can look into in terms of when they're debating or discussing issues around economic growth and trying to compare where Kenya is with our neighbors or in the region. It will provide different insights of what to look into or ways in which we can compare the country, not from what we had shared. It had been projected a few minutes ago. But basically, this is a 2-part presentation. So Jacqueline Kagume, who is the head of the Constitution, Law and Economics program, will go first and she will explain what the index is all about, provide a background to this, as well as go into some details on the methodology and provide insights on the overall results. Then thereafter, Leo Kemboi, who works together with Jackie in the Constitutional Law and Economics program, we will zero in on the East Africa Economic Freedom results. So basically, he will share the results of Kenya based on this index of economic freedom vis-a-vis our East Africa community members. And so after those two presentations that will take about 50 minutes, we'll then open it up for some Q&A session that will take about another 40 minutes. So as the presentation goes on, please, you can share whatever comments, questions that you have in the chat box. And then, of course, one presentation will go straight into the plenary. And I know by now that people are clear about the drills about webinars, so I will not go into that. Okay, so Jackie, I hope you are ready.
Yes, I am, John. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
You can go ahead, please.
All right. Thank you. Thanks a lot, John, for that introduction. So, as he stated, the presentation today will be made by the CLE program, and I work here with my colleague Leo. So, I'll go straight to the presentation. And so basically, this is, Leo, you can move to the next slide. Yeah, so basically this is the report that we are discussing here today. It's available online and we'll be able to share it after. That's the cover of the report. You can see the main others, but it's prepared annually by the Heritage Foundation. So we go to the outline. So this is our outline. As John has stated, I'll provide the brief background, basically discussing about the index and why we've determined that it's important to track the results. If you are an IEA member or a regular follower of IEA conversations, you must be aware that this is not our first time to make this presentation. We've done this over the last 3 years. So some of the things might already sound familiar to you, but for the benefit of those who haven't perhaps attended a previous meeting, we'll still go through the basic introductions for everyone's benefit. Then I'll explain how the index is measured, that's the methodology and the interpretation of the economic freedom score. And then my colleague Leo will come in and discuss the results, Kenya's results, and a comparative analysis, including observations from the EAC region. Then I'll come back and do the conclusion. So that's the first. So we go to the next. So in terms of our background, just basically trying to answer why do we, let me actually, before I start with the why, let me start by saying that the Index of Economic Freedom basically measures two things. So the first one is the impact of liberty, and two, the impact of free markets on the performance of different economies. So there are about 184 countries that were ranked in this year's index. That's the 2022 index. So across all the main categories, the main indicators and sub-indicators that I will define shortly, the two things that the index intends to assess is the impact of liberty and free markets on the performance of all the economies. So the 2022 index that we are looking at today basically covers the period between the 1st of July of 2020 to the 30th of June of 2021. So that's usually the period. So the 2022 index looks at the period until the end of the previous, it actually aligns with what is our financial year here. So, and as I've stated, it covers 184 countries. This most recent one covers 184 countries. This number sometimes shifts depending on the responses that they get. But yeah, so this is that's basically what the index does. So in terms of going back to answer why we decided or we thought it's important as a program to track the index, and I know, excuse me, I know John has said that I'd explain a little about what the CLE program at the IA does. So we track the performance of different institutions that are created by Kenya's constitution, just to check for the extent of adherence or the level of adherence to minimum constitutional thresholds. And also, the other thing we do is to apply legal and economic analysis to various policy choices. So in line with the core things that we do, we thought that this index provides a very useful tool for several things. So the first is that we know that the Constitution of Kenya guarantees various economic freedom, and it does this among other rights. So most of you may have had a look at the Bill of Rights, Chapter 4. Some of the freedoms covered there are economic freedoms, and actually most of the other basic human rights also interact to facilitate economic freedom. So, and some of the rights here that we can point out easily are property rights and the rights that are also covered under the index that we'll be discussing today. So we have, excuse me, we have property rights which are covered under Article 40 of the Constitution, which basically also includes the right to protection of intellectual property. We have the right to fair labor practices, that's under Article 41. Then we have consumer rights under Article 46, socioeconomic rights under Article 43, and as I've said, we also have other rights contributing to this. For instance, the rights to freedom, right to movement, right to association. Interpreted in one way or another, they all contribute to economic freedom. So the first reason why we thought it's important to track it is obviously that constitutional imperative or that those constitutional guarantees for economic freedom. And then second, we thought or we feel that indices, not only this index of economic freedom, increasingly we have different indices ranking different things, but what we thought is important is that they provide a good comparison in terms of the area that is being measured. So for instance, for this index of economic freedom, in terms of understanding or providing a comparison for purposes of understanding how different countries perform as measured against their peers. So I'll give an example. So for instance, if Kenya records dismal performance in one area, say Fiscal Health, and we will see from the results whether it recorded dismal performance in. If, for instance, Kenya records bad performance in one area, the index provides why that is so, and a few reasons are attributed to it, and we can then look at what other countries, either with similar economies like ours or those that have more advanced in terms of their development, what they've done differently or what their results say in terms of why they are ranked higher than us. So that comparison is very useful for any country that is actually interested in picking valuable lessons for development. That's the second. Then the third reason why we thought it's important to track is connected to the first that I've spoken about, that's the constitutional imperative. So the third reason is that this index is a useful tool in terms of providing or in terms of assessing the interaction between the constitutional, in terms of assessing the constitutional order. So basically looking at the interaction between states, the state institutions and citizens, the Kenyan citizens. So basically it allows us to see how the different actions that are taken by the state, the different restrictions by different state institutions, how they affect the conditions and opportunities for prosperity for the citizens. So it's clear to see that nexus just from looking at the results of the index. Then lastly, it's that we see that the pursuit of economic freedom is necessary for to achieve economic prosperity. So for that path to economic prosperity and to achieve some level of structural transformation, it's the results from this index can help inform that path. So we see that results from this IEF consistently show that countries that have an institutional environment where individuals and private enterprises are able to thrive, or where there's a high or moderate to high degree of economic freedom, these countries tend to do better in terms of economic development. There are higher levels of prosperity for the individual. So that is shown in this index. So those are the main reasons as to why we decided to track and do this annually. Then going now to how the index is measured. I apologize for those who've been here before because you've had this, but I will just repeat. So this index covers 12 economic freedoms, and these 12 economic freedoms are classified under 4 broad categories. So we have the rule of law category, we have the government size. I will go into the specifics as we go. So we have the rule of law category, we have the government size, we have regulatory efficiency, and the fourth is on open markets. So specifically within the rule of law, the index measures several things. So that's the first category. So those the things that are measured there are property rights, judicial effectiveness, and government integrity. Then, and more specifically, if we look at now within the property rights, the judicial effectiveness, and government integrity are the sub-indicators. At the indicators, sorry, and then the sub-indicators, you can see them listed there. So, for instance, under property rights, the main sub-factors we see are physical property rights, IP rights, which is also granted under our constitution, strength of investor protection, quality of land administration, and so on. Then for judicial effectiveness, the main things that are measured there, we have judicial independence, the quality of the judicial process, if there's favoritism in obtaining decisions, those are the main considerations. Then, and government integrity, this one primarily looks at issues to do with corruption, so irregular payments, embezzlement of funds, transparency in both spending and also in policy making. So the perceptions of corruption, so the public perception of corruption, and civil service transparency. So those are the main sub-indicators under the rule of law category. Then under the government side, the main things that are considered, or the main indicators, we have the tax burden. And here the sub-indicators are, they look at the top marginal tax rate on individual income, the tax rate on corporate income, and the total tax burden as a percentage of GDP. And the reason for this is to see whether the amount of the taxation policy actually accelerates the individual prosperity, or it is more constricting of, because the more an individual is taxed, the less amount of money they have for their discretionary expenses. So it also has an impact in terms of individual prosperity. So those are the main considerations under the tax burden indicator. Then when we go to government spending, the main things that they look at is the expenditures. So what's the total expenditure by the government, and then they compare that to the overall GDP over the last they calculate that over the last 3 years. Then in terms of the fiscal health, the main thing they look at is the average deficit as a percentage of GDP. Again, over the last 3 years, they look at the total public debt, and that is able to inform their consideration of how they determine the fiscal health of any state or any nation. Then the next category is under regulatory efficiency. We see that we also have now the 3 indicators where we have business freedom, and some of the things here include the time, costs, the time and the cost, and the various regulations and procedures that are involved when one needs to set up a business. So again, we know that if the regulation is very strict regulation, if we have overlapping legislation or regulation, then that has an effect on actually the formalization of businesses. So one of the reasons we've had over in the past for why we have very many unlicensed firms is because there have been complaints of multiple licenses and overlapping regulation that does not create a very favorable environment for enterprises to thrive. So that's business freedom. Then under labor freedom, the main things that we consider there, we have the ratio of the minimum wage to the average value added per worker. The other indicators are the hindrance to hiring additional workers, the rigidity of working hours, then difficulty of firing redundant employees, among other things that you can see there. So those are the main considerations. And then the last indicator there is on monetary freedom. And here the weighted average inflation rates for the most recent for the most recent years. So it's a qualitative judgment of the extent of government manipulation of prices through direct controls or subsidies. So that's the third and last consideration under that pillar on regulatory efficiency. Then in the fourth and last category, how on this index, so under open markets, they consider 3 things. That's trade freedom, investment freedom, and financial freedom. So for the trade freedom, we see that the trade is weighted average tariff rate. Yes, so they they calculate the weighted average tariff rate of the various tariffs for that in that region where the country subscribes to various trade agreements. They calculate the average tariff rate. Then for the investment freedom, you can see the main things that are considered there. We have the national treatment of foreign investment. We have various restrictions related to sexual investment, and we have expropriation of investment without fair compensation, among other controls that are restrictive. So all those considerations are made and a score is arrived at. And then lastly, under financial freedom, we see that here it's the extent of government regulation of financial services. So the index basically looks at to what extent does government regulate different financial services. Is it promoting growth or limiting the same? And it also looks at the extent of financial and capital market development, openness to foreign competition, or lack of it. So those are the main. That's how the index is measured. So we go to the next. So having looked at all the 4 broad categories, the main indicators there under and the sub-indicators. Now, how the scoring is done, or how you should interpret the scores, which will be presented shortly by Leo. scoring for each of the under each of those lines is done on a scale of 0 to 100. So for each of those pillars, and then the average is calculated. So the scale of economic freedom is then derived from an average calculation of those scores for the 5 categories. Then for any country that has an average score between 0 and 49.9, that's the lowest performing, it's the least performing, and those countries are categorized under the repressed economies. And then countries with scores between 50 and 59.9 are classified as mostly and free. And then those that have scores between 60 and 69.9 are classified as moderately free. And then while those between now 70 and 79.9 are classified as mostly free. And then now the A students, the top performers, the Luxembourg, the Switzerland, and the rest, those with a score between 80 and 100 are classified as free. And these are normally a reflection of, it's the ideal, it's what all states should actually be aspiring to. So they are a reflection of the ideal economic freedom that most states should be aspiring to. So in terms of, before Leo starts on the presenting on Kenya's findings, in terms of the regional leaders, looking at the findings of the 2022 index, the 7 free nations, so the ones that got a score between 80 and 100. We had Singapore, and they have consistently been here. We have Switzerland, we have Ireland, New Zealand, Luxembourg, I hope I pronounced that right, Taiwan, and Estonia. And then, so those are the global leaders. And then in terms of regional leaders, because the index also provides, not only does a global comparison, also it also does a comparison. So for the Asia Pacific region, obviously we have Singapore was the leader there. Then for the Middle East and North Africa, they are categorized as 1. So there we had the UAE, United Arab Emirates, was the leader. Then for Sub-Saharan Africa, consistently the leader has been Mauritius. Then we have in Europe, Switzerland, and for the Americas, we have Canada. So that's the introductory part of this presentation. I'll now ask Leo. Leo will now take us to the results, more detailed results, and then I'll come back into the conclusion. Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Jackie, and thank you, everyone. Now to give the perspective, to give Kenya's results for 2022, we'll show the 4 broad categories with the other sub-indicators below it. And so the first one, Kenya's performance. So you'll see the key here is that those colors in red represents a category that those specific rights, those specific economic freedoms are considered repressed. If you see orange, it's mostly and free. And then if you see amber, I think it's amber or yellow, the between 60 and 70, the score is considered to be mostly moderately free, and then between 70 and 80, which is light green, is it's considered mostly free, and then between 80 to 100, where Jackie calls now the ideal, where all states should be, is considered free. Now, if we check Kenya's performance for 2022 for property rights, judicial effectiveness, government integrity, it's ranked 40.6, 39, and 30.9, and those are what the index considers to be repressed. So here Kenya's performance is considered to be repressed, and there are explanations to it. Most of us know most of them, like the reporting, the wording that is used in the reporting, for example, for property rights, is that while property rights are recognized, enforcement is still a going concern. So, like land titling, most we consider that 70% of our land, of Kenya's land, is not titled. It's not secure, and that and those ones, the two judicial effectiveness, what is considered. So on judicial effectiveness, Kenya has an independent, impartial judiciary that whose functions have been clearly outlined in the Constitution, but at the same time they have weak institutional capacity, and these can be explained through what the IEA has identified over the years, that the resource constraint that the judiciary faces, and also not just the resource constraint alone, but how those inadequate resources are deployed at the moment. So, and the judicial effectiveness affects how property rights are enforced. Government integrity, and like Jackie explained, this one is particularly on corruption, absence of transparency in government policy making, and all those, and other indicators where also this is one place where Kenya lags behind. Primarily, although our constitution provides, for example, policy making, that public participation, it's that public participation for almost all issues is mandatory. This has not been the case. Meaningful public participation has not been attained, even from whether fiscal policy to all other most policy, other government policies. We've seen court petitions relating to issue of government, the issue of policy making, public participation, succeeding on that basis. On the issue of corruption, I don't want to belabor that point. I think extensive reporting, the admission by the president, other indices that rank Kenya, like the World Bank, CPIA, country policy institutional assessment, and other. There's extensive literature and extensive evidence that on the issue of corruption, that Kenya lags behind on that. So on government side, so three indicators: tax burden, government spending, and fiscal health. So on tax burden, Kenya's for the last 3 years has averaged around 17% as a share of GDP. That's tax collected as a share of GDP. And also the government spending 82.2%. The ranking, and then the fiscal health is 10. So for fiscal health, we are this particular sub-indicator, Kenya is considered to be repressed as per the results of 2022. So now to explain, just to reiterate what Jackie had explained, for tax burden, it's one of the ways a bigger tax burden shows is a proxy for government size, because the bigger the government, the size of government, the bigger expenditures that is required to run, and this of course comes from taxes. So it's the reason why it's a very important indicator to track is because a bigger government size would definitely indicate that this is would require more taxes to be. So what the index considers, Kenya 17%, it's still considered a fair share. And then, of course, the 82% for government spending. Anything above what the index considers, you might look at this that it's like it's artificially high, but what the index considers is that an expenditure of more than 30% of GDP on an annual basis would be considered, would start now to negate economic freedoms. So, but at 24.4 average for the last 2 years, when this index was measured, government spending is still considered to be comparatively globally to be still to be okay. On fiscal health, this one, a score of 10.9% for fiscal health. This one is considered, Kenya is considered to be repressed, and we consistently over the last 9 years now, the government, for fiscal health, it measures fiscal deficits and the public debt component. So public debt component officially based on government declared government declared debt, the gross public debt as per for example, the IMF report of December 2021 puts Kenya's debt as a share of GDP at 77%. At the same time, for fiscal deficits, the average for the last 9 years has been between 7.5 and 9.5%. This, of course, has implications for economic freedoms because it comes back again to the tax burden. It affects capital gross factor capital accumulation. This affects how farms are formed, how capital is deployed. It also affects access to credit in the domestic market. It affects other predominantly debt, the component debt that is not the debt that is acquired rapidly and more quickly and faster than the economic that is higher 4.5 percentage points above the economic growth, affects mostly all other economic indicators, and these affects the economic freedoms. Now, for this is where most of indicators here. So for business freedom, we ranked moderately free, and the dotted line shows the global average, although it's still below global average. For labor freedom, ranked moderately free, 56.8, and then for monetary freedom, 75.5. And then, of course, on the open market, it's still it's mostly unfree for the open markets. Trade freedom, 56, and then investment freedom, 55, and then financial freedom is 50. The major takeaways here is that this is mostly unfree, primarily because of the nature of so for business freedom, for the case of Kenya, we know the extent of regulations that affect the farm formation and to sustain those specific farms. The various data points to illustrate that one and that also for the labor freedom. While this Kenya is above the global average, the global average by a slightly a slighter margin. There are some of the things such as inspection of labor freedoms, severance pay, the issues related to minimum wages, because minimum wage constrains economic freedoms. For monetary freedom, this one, as Jackie mentioned, the major indicator here is inflation, and particularly inflation has remained within range, which is 2.5 plus or minus 5% of 5% rate, and that has, and also Kenya here is relatively higher than the global average, and is considered moderately free. For trade freedom, here it's the non-tariff barriers, and also the average tariff rate. And here Kenya is still as is considered that mostly the number of restrictions that is part of Kenya's trade policy, and as hampered the attainment, and we are far away, almost 15 points 15 points to global average. So relatively, this is an area where we needs to be done. Investment freedom, 55. It's still lower than the global average, just like the trade freedom. And then, of course, here the ease. What is measured here is the ease of the treatment for foreign investment, the ease of making those investments in the country, and foreign controls. Some of it, like for example, the one on land, is part of our constitution, that foreigners are only allowed to own land through lease, and not that the full ownership. And of course, financial freedom. This is still mostly unfree, but it's a little bit higher than the global average. And the reasons why Kenya's financial sector is more developed, it's not advanced yet, but it's relative to most states, it's developed. It's open to foreign competition. The level of state most of it is now private capital, even though private investment, even though there's still some state-owned banks, and the state ownership in Kenyan banks has reduced relative to other years, and here it's a bit higher. So now the next thing, from here I'm going to show some comparisons. So this is the economic freedoms overall, and it shows the graph for the world, which is the global average, and Kenya's. And one thing that you notice, we've pegged it at 2010, and our reason is that we need to start tracking those changes after Kenya promulgated one of the what is considered most legal scholars and public policy scholars consider it one of the most transformative constitutions. So we want to see whether those changes have yielded improvement in economic freedoms. So if you compare those differences, you will see that between 2010, the curves are diverging, with the exception of 2021. Why? So that's why we are saying this is divergence in economic freedoms. As economic freedoms globally are getting better, Kenya's economic freedoms are dwindling. And you can easily see the curve and the trend line where it's heading to. In 2021, part of what the report authors explain that drop, because the world average dropped from 61.6 to 60, and then for the score of Kenya 54.9 to 52.6, which both of those drops are significant to COVID-19 restrictions and enforcement, those specific enforcements. And you can see the trend from 2020 as up to now. So the COVID effect, because mostly for those physical distancing measures to work, the state had to restrain some of those freedoms. I'll compare each of those rights and try and go quickly over it. For property rights, what you see, the Kenyans, for the keys down below the graph, for Kenya is the blue line. And what you see evidently from the graph is that most of East African states for 2022 are in the category of, with the exception of Rwanda, are in the category of mostly and free. And there is an explanation. For example, for the case of Kenya, it's the explanation is inadequate enforcement of those property rights, that giving those constitutional principles the right that enforcing those constitutional principles. And then of course for the case of and mostly here the proxy here that the report cites is land. So say titles are unsecured for the case of Kenya, like the case of Tanzania, which is ranked repressed. All land belongs to the state. Of course, they recognize those secured interests, but the registration of those land titles are difficult. And Uganda, as we all know, Uganda uses the customary land tenure. And of course, for Rwanda, the law protects property rights and contractual rights, but still, of course, the power of the state is still immense in that registration. And then, of course, for Burundi, the state capacity, it's what we call those failing state capacity for them to be able to enforce those rights. Judicial effectiveness. This is a new indicator. So, like Jackie mentioned, this indicator has been running from 1995 to present, but the judicial effectiveness indicator was introduced in 2017. Part of it is to measure the ability to resolve conflicts as required through the judiciary. So Kenya here is ranked third. All East African countries here are considered repressed, while Rwanda, which was high enough which was considered moderately free in 2017, has fallen down to the repressed. So all EAC countries in this case are repressed. Why so? But the explanation from the report is that for example, for the case of Kenya, the judiciary lacks weak state capacity, weak institutional capacity. And then, of course, for Tanzania, it's poorly resourced, judiciary is poorly resourced, ill-trained, and also politically influenced. And of course, for Uganda, influence from the military, significant backlogs, which is also a feature of all EAC countries, endemic corruption, lack of funding, and technical capacity. And then, of course, for Rwanda, it's not fully independent and capacity constraints. So, and mostly this one is is explained by the political changes that happened through the constitution amendment that was done in 2015, and then it watered down the ability, the independence of judiciary. EACs for government integrity, and this is largely the transparency of policy making and corruption. So all countries, with the exception of Rwanda, are considered repressed. So Rwanda for the 2022 is mostly unfree, while the rest are below the score 50, which is explained by, so below the score 50, which are considered repressed, which the economic freedoms emanating from this are considered repressed. And it's the aspect of the pervasiveness of corruption, and that's why government integrity. Kenya expected Kenya to stand out of this because the separation of powers clause in the constitution, Kenyan constitution, was expected to solve most of the largest, bigger problems facing government integrity, and also how the state does response through policy, how the state does its policy making. But overall, the EAC here is still, most of it is considered mostly unfree for the case of Rwanda, and the rest, the economic freedoms are considered repressed. And then, of course, for tax burden, one of the things that you notice with tax burden is that, and this one, as Jackie had explained, it measures the average, the average tax to GDP component. One of the things that you consider is those changes. Here, this is where the performance, the tax burden within EAC is still relatively better. For the case of Kenya, the performance has stagnated. We are considered moderately free here, and the performance, the blue line, has stayed between 78 and 79 between 2010. For those 12 years, the performance has stagnated. For the case of Burundi, the performance has tried to go up, and here it's the size, the amount of taxes that the state extracts from its citizens. So much of it is not larger than 30%, because that's where they would have, the score would have gone down. For government spending, again, this is where the EAC still stands out. The performance has stagnated for the last 12 years. Burundi's performance has considerably improved. Here, most of them are considered moderately free. For the case of with the exception of only Rwanda, Uganda, and Tanzania are considered free. Then most of them are mostly free, moderately free, and the only exception and the here is that a negative score, a lower, the more your government, the government spending as a share of GDP goes above 30%, the lower your score becomes. So mostly the largest, actually, for this case is Kenya. The biggest spender is Kenya as a share of GDP, and it's not yet above 30. It's around 25% of GDP. So for fiscal health, this is where Kenya is ranked last, and as I explained, most of East African nations are ranked between mostly and free, that is Uganda, and then of course Rwanda. Uganda and Rwanda are considered Uganda is mostly and free with a score of 55, and then of course Rwanda with a score of 61 is considered moderately free, and the country that has a better score in this area is Tanzania, which is above 90, which is free. And here it's the budget deficits. The major indicator here is the budget deficits. If you look at Tanzania's budget deficit, has remained consistently low. So what the report indicates is an average of 1.6% points for the last 3 years when this indicator was scored. Of course, for Burundi and Kenya, for Kenya, it's a low score between when the indicator was introduced first in 2017, and the major explanation here, Kenya's budget deficits have remained considerably high, even within the region, and partly contributed to that low score. Fiscal health. All East African countries here, their performance for the last decade has been stagnant, or for most of them reducing, as you can see from the indicators. So for the case of Kenya, we are considered in this economic freedoms from this are considered moderate, so mostly and free. Rwanda, which had in 2010 was considered moderately free, has gone down all through. And this is the restrictions, the regulations, because the power of the state in coercion and the dominance of state-owned enterprise. This dismal performance can only be explained by those. Of course, for the case of Burundi, it's the failing state capacity in Burundi. But the performance of Kenya, of Uganda, Tanzania, Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, and Burundi, Kenya and Rwanda, the performance has been on a stagnation, which is like it's a decline. Of course, the labor freedom. One thing, I looked at the data for the labor freedom. Part of what is measured as part of the labor freedom is labor force participation rate. So the sudden drop from in between 2020 and 2022 across all the East African countries is a factor of labor force participation rate. And as you can see from the last decade, the labor freedoms have remained the same, but partly the reason because labor force participation rate is one of the indicators measured under the labor freedoms. Because of the growth, that shift has not occurred. Most of East African economies, most of their labor is still informal, and the formal sector participation rate has remained stagnant. The economic growth has not influenced that shift from informality to formal sector jobs, and that labor force participation rate has not shifted significantly. That's why you see the performance has been stagnant. And it's also a factor, it's also an indication of that, because labor force participation rate is one of the things that is measured in here. It's an indication that shift has not, because the shift has not occurred, the structure of labor markets has not changed. That's why you still see that performance. But that sharp drop between 2020 and 2022 is an indication of the COVID effect, because it altered the labor force participation rate. Monetary freedom. All countries in 2022 for East Africa are considered between moderately free, are considered moderately free, and there's been those sporadic changes, with the lowest being Burundi and Tanzania, and third in line is Rwanda. Kenya ranks second, and also Uganda ranks first. Those sharp changes are part of changes, the changes in monetary policy, but inflation targeting this region has remained consistently almost the same, and the economic fundamentals have not changed much so this is one of the indicators where the EAC countries rank better. For trade freedom, it's one of those indicators that has been on a decline, and trade freedom measures two things, which is the average rate of the average tariff rates, and secondly, the non-tariff barriers. So this is like qualitative analysis of the non-tariff barriers. Again, you see, of course, the COVID trend, the COVID effect might have exacerbated the decline in trade freedoms, and because this can be explained by those it's been reported in the public domain, the issues at the border relating to when COVID was announced, some of the countries put in place some restrictions to ensure that some of the commodities, the movement of some of supplies, especially relating to public health. But overall, in the last decade, the number of non-tariff barriers for individual countries has risen, and this has occurred that index, then the index to be scaled to go down. So investment freedom. So this one especially touches on the foreign investment. So part of it is that the changes in Kenya, the changes for Kenya have remained. The changes for the Kenya indicator has been rated 55 since 2017 to 2022. It was repressed. It was in 2010. It was 45. It went up to 50 in 2011, and then remained at 50 until 2015. It rose by another to 60 in 2016, and then it went down and has remained consistently at 55 ever since. And that can for most countries. So this is the foreign investment code, and it shows that restriction as those changes, and that the flexibility in changing the foreign investment code to attract foreign investment it remains constantly almost the same. And you can easily see that it mirrors 5 years. Those, I don't know whether those are can be called election cycles, or can be called regime changes or changes in principal policymakers such as treasuries and central banks in these specific places. But there is a pattern here, and it's clear that while those for those specific countries, and it's the same for all these EAC countries. Yeah. So, but most of all EAC countries between 2017 and present are considered to be mostly and free in the the investment freedom code. Another one is the financial freedom. As Burundi lags behind, it's been rated 30 since 2010 up to present. Same to Kenya, it's been rated 40. It's same to Kenya, it's been rated 50. And then of course for Uganda, it was rated a little bit higher, 60, which is mostly free for 3 years, and then it dropped back all through. Financial freedom, mostly for the case of Kenya, while the sectors relative to East African countries, the sector is more advanced compared to the rest of countries, but state interventions in this area has remained consistently high. You all remember the interest rates debate and the regulation of financial institutions generally is what has made Kenya's score remain a little bit low. And because the ideal situation is to be above 70, but yet remained at 50 consistently since 2010. So one thing, and the first, so for observations, just to reiterate, economic freedoms correlates with well-being. It correlates with other factors such as and which well-being, especially health, education, environment, innovation, societal progress, and democratic governance. And these, I think the EAC results illustrate this. So just to give context, within these 5 countries that we've compared, Tanzania is ranked highly, which is as number 93 globally, but it's 10th out of 47 in sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, it's the country that follows next is Rwanda, which is 105, 16, number 16 out of 47. Uganda is 127, which is number 24 out of 47. It's 138, which is number 28 out of 47. And then, of course, Burundi, which is Kenya 138, 28, Burundi is 172, which is number 45 out of 47 in sub-Saharan Africa. And you can see, but the difference between countries that are ranked between 90 and above, 90 to 184, the difference is, of course, consider it's minimal, like if you measure progress in these areas. And then, of course, the divergence as world economic freedoms have gotten better. Kenyan economic freedoms have continued to decline, and this would form part of what we think should be the place to improve it. And then, of course, Kenya's performance on government integrity, which is corruption and transparency in policy making, financial freedom, investment freedom, monetary freedom, labor freedom, have stagnated in the last 7 years. So no much progress has been made. And then, of course, the fourth one, the ranking of Kenya's fiscal health, the indicator on fiscal health, is an indictment of fiscal indiscipline of the last decade. I think this one, we've looked at the budget deficits. The IE has complained about this for the last for the last decade about the fiscal indiscipline, and this ranking continues to show that those budget deficits have been a major factor in driving the economic freedoms down. And then, of course, within the EAC, trade freedom has been falling. So again, it's the issue of tariff barriers, the average tariff rate, and also non-tariff barriers. So generally, in conclusion, these issues matters: the complexity of the foreign investment code, the non-tariff barriers that are instituted, the power of government, corruption, issues of budget deficit, and the rest of those of all those issues significantly affect economic freedoms. So thank you so much. I will take back to Jackie so that she can do the part on conclusions and policy recommendations.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Leo. So just to conclude and summarize from the two presentations, what we are saying, we are proposing, we have 5 main conclusions and recommendations that we make from the 2022 IEF, and especially as relates to Kenya's performance. So having looked at our own performance and also compared it to that of other states in the region, the first thing we're saying is that if we are to make progress and move from the mostly unfree category that we have been for the last almost decade, one of the things we can do is to accelerate full constitutional implementation, or advocate for full constitutional implementation. We have said here repeatedly that, and it has also been said here and elsewhere, that Kenya has a very progressive constitution. So if we implemented fully the rights that are guaranteed there, or caused for the implementation and the respect for the upholding of those rights, some of the concerns that we see being raised under this index would not occur, and that would obviously lead to better scores across the 4 different categories. So that's an easy first one. Proper implementation of the constitution would make us realize different results. Then the second thing that we see is that we scored badly on the rule of law category, and one of the reasons was because of our performance when it comes to property rights. So we are saying here that there is need to reduce the intrusion of the state on people's property. Increasingly, we've seen that happen, and this is both in terms of land and other property. So we've seen several cases where we've had contested land titles, contested ownership between the government and private citizens. All these are things that are considered when it comes to the ranking. And these are some of the factors that are dragging Kenya's performance under that category on property rights. So we need to, and the index specifically says also, and I think Leo mentioned here, that we need to, government needs to come up with innovative ways on addressing the issue of titling land, because as it is, most of the titles are not secure, and we have about 70% of the land being untitled. So in spite of the recent efforts to digitize the systems and processes at the house here, it has not borne fruit so far, and these are some of the things that are causing the drag on the performance under this category. So proper measures need to be effected to be able to address that. Then third, we are saying that for the scores around judicial effectiveness, there should also be various things can be done to address the challenge that we see there. So the first what we're proposing is an increase in the case resolution rate, because these are the things that are dragging the performance. I know in the State of the Judiciary annual reports, they've been showing that they have been making some improvements, some significant improvements, but it's still not at an ideal level, because the case backlog remains significant, and there is obviously a need for more resources in terms of personnel, HR personnel, and also actual money resources to address the challenges, the resource gaps that we see at the judiciary. So the case backlog issue has several elements to it, but it would also, a reduction to that would also see improvement in terms of our performance on that rule of law category where we performed badly. Then the other thing that we say we found is one of the challenges that we've been seeing in our criminal justice system is there's an issue of congestion, and this has been stated by different policy makers in the past. We've had complaints previously from the former Chief Justice. We've had complaints from the DPP of our congested system. And what we have found from our own analysis as a program is one of the main contributing factors for this is we have a very high number of unconvicted prisoners in our prisons, for instance. And this is just one of the things that simple things which if we found innovative solutions for, would lead to better performance for the in this category. So there would be need to reduce that high number of unconvicted prisoners, which is also like increasing the number of persons held in confinement. Then I've already mentioned the issue of operational and resource independence. So the judiciary, we've tried to make the case for them here at the IEA and especially at the CLE program several times that it's been underfunded. So and one of the findings from this IEF this index was that the public perception in terms of the performance of the Kenyan judiciary is not that there's corruption. The levels of the perception of corruption has reduced greatly. So it's perceived as being independent, impartial, but the only things that are limiting its performance is a weak institutional capacity. And most of this is it can be linked to a resourcing gap. And so again, we continue to make the case that there needs to be proper adequate resourcing to strengthen this. Then for the fiscal health indicator, what we are proposing, we are saying that the government should consider enacting some type of regulation to enhance fiscal discipline. And I think Leo has spoken about this. So the findings obviously show that we have been having growing deficits, and which this shows that Kenya, and IEA has also mentioned this many times, that we continue to live beyond our means, and part of the consequences for those deficits is a growing public debt. And so what we're saying is that there's need for some level of regulation to cap the spending. This has been IEA's proposal for many years, either to cap the spending either as a share of GDP or the actual spending as a nominal value. So put a cap on that. And the reason why this has been proposed several times was the fiscal discipline will reduce the burden, not only the debt repayment burden, not only on us or this current generation, but also on future generations, and ensure sustainable, that we have we are guaranteeing some level of sustainable development. So some proper regulation to address that challenge on the fiscal health would be necessary. And then lastly, what the last recommendation, the conclusion we are seeing is we have noted challenges in terms of regulation of businesses, challenges in terms of the economic freedoms relating to business formation and the operation of business. So our proposal here is for extensive deregulation, both at the national and county levels, and mostly for the restrictive regulations limiting the business freedom. So I think both Leo and I have talked about the multiple and overlapping regulations and requirements for licenses for different businesses. And this, as I said earlier, limits the performance and formalization of different businesses and enterprises. So either harmonizing this into one all-encompassing regulation or just and removing some of those prohibitive restrictions would be a way to accelerate business. Just this morning, Leo and I were looking at a survey, a regulatory audit survey produced in 2020 by the Kenya Association of Manufacturers. And just to point out one example, for instance, they had said that survey found that for the chemical and allied sectors, firms in the chemical and allied sectors are required. There are about 33 different charges or regulations that they have to 33 different charges that they have to adhere to before you can actually be in business. So you can imagine the effect this has on those businesses, and obviously a consequence in terms of limitation of the freedom in terms of proper operation of those businesses. So we're saying that there's need for extensive deregulation, not only at the national but also at the county level to spur growth and just basically expand the economic freedom. So that is our conclusion. And I thank you for your time and hand this back to John. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks a lot, Jackie and Leo, for taking us through some of the results actually of the index of economic freedom. Starting all the way from why we track the index, pivoting it to the Constitution of Kenya 2010, sharing the methodology, and then all the way to discussing the results according to the different categories for Kenya, vis-a-vis for the East Africa, and you can see already where Kenya lies, not only globally but also in relation to its EAC member states, and the areas in which we are struggling in. So I think you guys have done a good job in terms of giving the key highlights, observations, and the conclusion. So I will not reiterate that. And given that time is not on our side, we'll just go straight into the Q&A session. So I don't see any query or comment in the chat box. So I'd like to invite our participants. Feel free to either raise your hand or just unmute yourself and pose your question to either Jackie or Leo. Anyone? So there is okay, there is somebody from So there's Vincent who is, okay. So Vincent, I think we'll get back to you on that. Vincent is asking whether he can quote either Jackie. Jackie, maybe you can respond to that. Whether you or Leo can be quoted in a newspaper story.
John, I think we can definitely have a conversation for any clarifications that Victor needs after this.
Yes.
But for our findings, they are all based on the IEF, and none of the comments or presentation was our own subjective considerations. So it's informed by the findings of the report. So I believe he can, but let's clarify whatever he needs to record in the to report on, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So Vincent, basically Jackie will get back to you on this. So there's a question from Emmanuel, our colleague here at IEA, and actually there are two. So I'll start with the one from Emmanuel, and his question is so what he's asking is that what are the most innovative advocacy interventions or strategies to address these problems that you have seen anywhere around the globe? That is fiscal indiscipline. So maybe is it Leo? Leo, you can respond to that. And then Kwame's question is, what does IEF scores for Kenya tell us about the priorities for policy research and public engagement? So Jackie, you can take up that. So let's start with Leo.
Yeah. So fiscal indiscipline. If you remember, when the public debt was shifted again in 2018, the IEA proposed that Kenya should have a fiscal rule, partly because it was to limit the amount of what you can borrow in a year, say not more than 500 billion, for example, so that in 3 years you borrowed 1.5 trillion. But what happened was that the ceiling argument won the day, and Treasury has been able to borrow 3 trillion, for example. That's just to illustrate one of the ways in which what we were proposing. Because what happens when you propose a fiscal rule, you fix and especially a lower fiscal rule like 4-5% of GDP, or even lower than that, it forces the National Treasury and generally the GOK to prioritize spending and be able to spend in ways you are able to spend on meaningful things such as public goods, only public goods, and largely in a way that raises people's welfare. But now that didn't happen. So there are several problems I can mention. To tie back to what Kwame is asking about policy research, I can give one example, like on trade. Part of trade policy, Kenya's trade policy, should reflect that for now, Kenya, the biggest aspect that is happening now is that most farms, most Kenyan farms have to join value chains, like value chains, which means that you might be producing an intermediate good, or a good is being finished in Kenya, so that you are bringing in something else to finish it here in Kenya, or producing an intermediate good and sending it overseas to some other place so that it can be finished there. So trade policy has to reflect the realities of today. And so that means the tariff rates that are being proposed, that are part of, for example, what the EAC, for example, or under the WTO or within any other trade arrangement, has to reflect the realities of today. That it's no longer, no country maintains a dominance of one good, so we form part of value chains, and that is something. So that is one example. There are those examples that the IE is pursuing now, like the one of congestion of prisons and the rest. So there are wider varieties. So just to go, thank you, John. Just to answer the part of that question.
Yeah, thanks, Leo. Jackie, any additions to either of the two queries? I mean, to the the one that posed by Kwame, and whether you have any additions to the query that is posed by Emmanuel.
Yeah. So to add to what Leo has said, in terms of priorities for policy research and public engagement. So I think what is clear from the findings, and especially in the areas where Kenya has performed, where our performance is subpar, and that's mainly under the rule of law category mostly, and also actually in most of these almost all of the categories, it's clear that governments, the policy responses are not informed adequately or by proper research, or if informed by research, then there's a problem with execution of the proposals and recommendations that that come out of that research. So I think either we have, either in my view, I would say either we have there are challenges in terms of the policy research, and I would say probably the government has not been making adequate considerations of the different proposals that are made by the public, or also that public engagement has been limited, or public participation in terms of making some of the decisions that inform implementation of these rights has been limited. So I would say that there's need for prioritization, for more research, to inform proper policies that are more responsive to the challenges that we see from these findings. I don't know if that answers his question, but he can also just clarify if there's what the question meant, in case we haven't adequately covered it, and then we'll see. Yeah, so that's all I can say. Then I think Leo has responded to Emmanuel's part, so I will not attempt an answer. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, and John, to answer,
to
add also something that I've forgotten. Most Kenyans don't know the public education around what economic freedoms are and the power of constitution. The power of constitution, especially transformative, those principles that expand the rights is something that has not been ventilated. Most Kenyans still, you see admiration, for example, for autocratic leaders, like the one that most people are discussing now. So that admiration shows that part of these freedoms have not, most people do not understand the power of economic freedoms and the power of rights. And this is something that can be pursued. Also, issues on the size of government, issues on taxation, especially fair taxation, mentioned trade policy, mentioned the financial market, and especially the role of financial regulators in the market. Issues of the investment code. And there are two things to this. I think that IE has emphasized this. The foreign investment, if the treatment of foreign investment and the treatment of Kenyan investment reflect two realities. So like one cannot be better than like the rest. If the business environment for local portfolio investment is not high, it's not like if the business environment is as bad as for local investment, it's equally as bad for private investment, for foreign investment. So, and there are several things that show that these are some of the most important issues that can be part of public policy research. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Leo and Jackie. Participants, any question? Vincent, do you have any question? Omar? Oh, I'm just now calling out your names. Okay, so I don't see any query, neither. Okay, so thanks, Vincent. Okay, then, yeah, that's fine, Vincent, yeah. Okay, so there have been no other query from our participants. I will invite both our speakers, starting with Leo, to make any just final remarks or just give any final thoughts on this. Leo, then Jackie. Your final remarks, please.
Yeah. So the pursuit of economic freedoms and the pursuit of not just economic freedoms, the pursuit of liberty, the pursuit of constitutional enforcement of rights, especially those constitutional, the Bill of Rights, as outlined in Kenya, remains one of the most important things for our generations, and for us to see benefits of stronger states and stronger and democratic stronger institutions and expanded democratic governance. It's imperative that we track these economic freedoms. And for the case of Kenya and the case of EAC, there are things that we do probably not bad, but there are things that we have that we see dismal performance, and those are things that remained that needs to be improved, especially things as sacred as property rights. And so those are parts those are things that remained of to our interest as a program and also to the IEA, and we'll commit to bring this on an annual basis for the next decade and as long as possible. Yeah. So thank you so much to everyone for listening to us and the questions and everything else. So asante sana.
Thanks.
Leo.
So to echo what Leo has said, yes, we intend to continue tracking this for the foreseeable future. And in summary, I think we've shown that, or the index has shown us repeatedly that the benefits of economic freedom are manifest in many ways, and some of these are greater income and wealth for the individual, better health, cleaner environments, among others. This is stated in the report. So we cannot overstate the benefits. So there's therefore need for different actors in this policy field to continue advocating for adherence to the greatest extent possible for adherence to expanded economic freedom. And so let's learn from the areas where we did not perform very well. We see there are many opportunities for growth. We can learn from what others are doing and also just learn from our own bad scores and see what we can do to improve on that. So mine is just to urge for all the different actors in this field and also policymakers to just use the findings from this as evidence for formulation of better, more responsive and progressive policies. So thank you and thanks everyone. Thanks, John.
Okay, many thanks to both Jackie and Leo for sharing those insights on IEF, Index of Economic Freedom 2022. I'm sure our participants, you've gotten various lots of insights, talking points on different issues that you can use for discourse, whether it's in the office, whether it's at your workplace, in public arena, and even if you're a student there, you can already, we pointed out different things that different issues that you can even consider depending on your interest. And of course, in the run-up to this to election and during the campaigns, these are different talking points that you can use, of course, to engage with the different candidates and different parties as they continue to campaign. So that's actually food for thought and fodder for public discourse. So thanks a lot also to our participants for taking time to join us for this webinar. Just to mention, IEA is a membership organization, and so we would like to invite you, if you're interested, to join us, to be a member, and the benefits of membership are clear and they're actually on our website. So please, you can check through our website for some of those benefits as well as the contacts. If you'd like to be a member, you can get in touch with our communication department. So thanks a lot, and wish you a good afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
you